Welcome everybody. Welcome Sharon, welcome Rebecca. I am excited to talk today about how to build a commercially successful podcast at the International Women's Podcast Festival. My name is Arielle Nissenblatt. I am the community manager at squadcast.fm, and I'm the founder of Earbuds Podcast Collective, and I am honored to be moderating this conversation between the two of you. Before we go any further, I would love for everybody to know who you are. So if you could tell us your name, what you do, a bit about your story. Let's start with Rebecca.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Steinberg. I am an agent at UTA, United Talent Agency in the audio group. I'll tell you a little bit about UTA. Logline, UTA is a 360 global talent and entertainment company representing some of the biggest actors, athletes, musicians, writers, gamers, creators, digital influencers in the world. I actually come from the buyer side. I used to be at a company called Acast, where I actually worked with Sharon, and I've been at UTA for about 3.5 months or so. Happy to be here. Sharon.
Great to have you. And Sharon.
Hey, I am Sharon McMahon. I'm the host of Sharon Says So, which is built off of my social media platform, which is also called Sharon Says So. I'm a longtime teacher. I've been an entrepreneur for a long time. And so I sort of meld those two ideas together to bring nonpartisan, fact-based education about government and history to the internet.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we are here today at the International Women's Podcast Festival in partnership with Pinterest to talk about commercially successful podcasts. There are a lot of podcasts out there in the world today. New ones popping up all the time. I can tell you that my inbox gets, I want to say, 10 emails a day about new podcasts that are being put out into the world from big companies that in theory are going to have some commercial success behind them, or at least that's the hope. So tell me how do you both define a commercially successful podcast? Obviously, you're coming at it from two separate areas. One of you is a creator, one of you represents creators. So let's start with Sharon on that one. What is a commercially successful podcast?
I mean, obviously people get to define what success is for themselves, but for me, a commercially successful podcast is one in which I can certainly cover all of the costs of running the podcast, paying for my team, and then also paying myself for my time and talent that it takes to go into making a podcast of this nature. So some people's version of commercial success is going to be like, yay, this isn't costing me money. And other people's is going to be like, oh, only 20 million. I don't know if I can say yes to that.
And Rebecca, what about from your side of things?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think it ultimately depends on the creator's goals. So commercially successful could mean it's a show with a massive audience that reaches tons of people each week. And we have advertisers who are interested in advertising on that show and reaching those audiences. It could also mean a podcast that has told a really incredible story, that has developed really unique IP, and we can take that IP and turn it into something else in the television, film, books, licensing space. And sometimes those shows don't reach audiences as wide. So it really depends on kind of the goal of the creator, the goal of the podcast, and how they're looking to build a business. So there are a few different directions it can go in.
Absolutely. So I think many of the folks who are going to be watching our conversation later are creators themselves or are looking to become creators. They may be looking to make a profit. They may be looking to just have a good time with audio. And eventually that leads to something that pays them in some way. So I'm wondering, before we really get into Sharon, before we get into your show, before we get into what it takes, Rebecca, for you to identify talent and to represent them, what's an example of a show that you have seen rise up from being an independent show to one that was represented commercially and then was able to make some money? I think, just as an example, one that comes to mind for me is a show that started out kind of smaller and then grew because of the immense talent of the individuals within, is My Dad Wrote a Porno. So that's kind of a fun one. Can you all think of ones that have stuck out in your mind as, clearly the talent was there and they were discovered and then the money came?
Well, Sharon Says So to begin with, but I know we're going to dive into that later. Another show that I worked on that was a real success story is Forever 35. It's a podcast hosted by Dori Shafrir and Kate Spencer. It's all about beauty and wellness and kind of, stories about women and business. And they started from nothing and they built their podcast up and really found this incredibly engaged audience very quickly. And from there, they've been able to build a very sustainable business. They are a UTA client, but I did work with them at my previous job, and it was amazing to see the attention they received from advertisers and just how fanatical their audience was and how engaged they were in literally everything they did. So they're able to kind of extend from there and build other platforms off the back of their very successful show.
I can think of one, which is hosted by my friend Kate Winkler Dawson, which is called Tenfold More Wicked. And she was not a celebrity of any kind before she started this sort of historic crime podcast. And of course, anything about crime, there's something about it that women of a certain age are very attracted to. So she had that going for her, but she really found a unique voice in the podcast industry in that she brings in musicians to score the podcast with period specific and geographically specific music. So if it's set in like 1800 Scotland, musicians are going to play that kind of background music. She's a journalism professor actually in Texas and has really found a unique niche in podcasting.
Wow. That's the kind of show that it clearly is taking so much time and talent to put together that you better hope she's getting paid.
That's right. Right. You can't just go on the street and be like, anyone play a period specific mandolin for free? That there, in order to make that kind of show, there has to be some revenue driving it.
Right. All right. So Rebecca, I've got a question for you. I think, I have heard the term agent for a really long time. When you're thinking about Hollywood, you think about agents, but it's a little bit less obvious when you think about a podcast agent. So what do you look for when you're thinking about representing somebody? What does an agent do at UTA in the audio division?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question. So, high level, an agent is tasked with negotiating deals and thinking very strategically about building business on behalf of our clients. So more specifically, our group, the UTA audio team, represents traditional film, TV, digital talent, as well as talent endemic to the audio space in podcasts. We work with podcast talent across all genres and categories and look at a client's podcast holistically with the goal of tapping into the broader UTA ecosystem to really grow their business and extend it from there. One of our first goals is to secure smart deals on behalf of our podcast clients with buyers like a Spotify or an Amazon or a SiriusXM, which might mean up-leveling their deal at their current podcast company. It might mean helping them find a new home with better financial terms. It also might mean seeking out new opportunities on premium and social audio platforms. Really, we're trying to be opportunistic in all areas of audio, acting as kind of the connective tissue, if you will, between all areas of our clients' business, with the goal of helping them really build a cohesive brand or platform. And then across the agency, we're steering traditional film, TV, writer, producer talent into the podcast space, helping them build out a podcast strategy, working with them very closely on the development front. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're bringing audio talent, their brand, their IP that emerges from podcasts and bringing it into the film and television space, merchandising, licensing, books, speaking, touring, really every area that UTA touches. And I think what's really cool about being a client of UTA is that doors start to open as we work with you. And we're really excited when we can expand an audio business, let's say, into the television world. In terms of what we look for in talent, we are looking for people who are really ambitious about the audio space, who have a clear perspective, who have a story that they want to tell, who have something really unique that they're bringing to audio. It's not easy. It's a lot of hard work. Sharon will tell you about that. And you have to be invested in putting out really good content week to week in order to really build something that's sustainable. So we're looking for clients who are willing to be collaborative and who are willing to work really hard with us.
Yeah, and I think it is definitely also about the long game. When you are thinking about working with clients, I think a really important factor to consider is, how long have they been at this and how long do they plan to be at this? Because as we know from a lot of prior podcast examples, sometimes it takes a while to build up an audience. So how does that factor into your decision to work with somebody or not?
We try to be really honest up front with the talent that we're working with, that it's not you publish your show and you immediately have audience. Some creators are lucky like that, but most aren't. I think it can take up to, like, I heard some crazy statistic. It was like a year and a half for most people to even reach like 5,000 listeners, 10,000 listeners.
Yeah.
So we're honest about the fact that it's a lot of hard work. But at the end of the day, as I said, if they have a story that they're dying to tell and we believe this story needs to be out in the world, we are going to invest the time and effort in getting that podcast out. So that's how we're kind of, being honest about the issue at hand, which is it's challenging, and then getting these podcasts out there.
So you mentioned before about smart deals. Tell me what you mean by smart.
Smart deals. A tough question. I mean, I think it really comes down to the deal points, what we're negotiating. We are looking to, put our talent in a place of power where they have say in their next move. So oftentimes that might mean, putting one of the creators that we work with into a year-long deal rather than locking them into something 3 years where they're exclusive to a platform and they can't do anything else. The goal here is to build a business and not be hindered by a partner. So we try to keep all avenues as open and clear as possible for the talent that we're working with so that they can, build a podcast and simultaneously build a subscription platform elsewhere without being tied to one platform or another. That's what I mean by smart deals.
Yeah, so advocating on behalf of your client for the best deal possible for them.
Exactly. And sometimes it's financially driven and sometimes it's also just about strategy. It doesn't always have to do with money. It's about building something together. So
love that. So let's shift a bit to Sharon's story. First, I want to ask you, Rebecca, how did you first come across Sharon and her podcast?
I was actually not at UTA when Sharon and I started working together. I was at a buyer called Acast, and I was lucky enough to be on the receiving end of the Sharon Says So podcast, and I actually negotiated a deal between Acast and UTA. Then I moved over to UTA, and now we're working with each other from representation perspective. But UTA sent me Sharon's podcast back then, and I listened to it. I thought it was so well produced, so thoughtful. There was clearly an audience there. She was using her platforms very strategically, and it was clear that it was a winner, from the get-go. Does that answer your question, Arielle?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get some background on the show itself. So Sharon, how did it start?
It started because I received 42,000 DMs saying, please start a podcast. And it was one of those things where I was always like, maybe someday. That is a lot of work and I don't know how to do it. And so once I have acquired all the necessary knowledge, then I will give it some thought. Like that was sort of the headspace that I was in. It was not a no, I'm never doing that. It was like, I don't know how to do that. And so someday when I figure it out, maybe I'll consider it. Ultimately, there was so much demand for longer form content. A lot of what I do is on Instagram, and it only allows you a very short amount of time to share a story for something. And so there was this demand for longer form content that they could then more easily share off of social media. I think that's an interesting aspect that maybe some people don't consider when they're thinking about starting a podcast, is that if all you're sharing is on social media, that content generally has a very short life. It is not nearly as evergreen as podcast content can be. And so this was a venue, an avenue that I could use to create longer form, more evergreen content that my audience was asking for.
Makes sense. Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing that. So Sharon, for folks who don't know your show, just give us your 2 sentences. What is the show about? And then I would love to know how you became passionate about the topics.
I always like to say that my show is all of the best brain tingle moments from history and government. It's not politics. It's not here's why Donald Trump is terrible or why you should love him. That's not what it is. Not a collection of today's news, but it is people and stories in particular that perhaps you don't know about. And then once you find out about them, it creates that sort of like, I did not know that. And that is fascinating. And then you want to tell everybody about the thing that you just learned because it's very exciting. So how I became interested really is, as a longtime teacher, I've spent my career looking for these kinds of stories. If you can entertain a room of 17-year-old boys, then you have it made. You know what I mean? 17-year-old boys in a way that is that their mothers would approve of. Then you know that you have a strategy that can hold people's attention. 17-year-old boys who don't want to be there, who are only to be there because they are required to graduate so they can play hockey. That's sort of where this passion and this skill came from, is finding ways to both educate and entertain at the same time.
Those are my favorite types of podcasts. Absolutely. And I think that's how a lot of longtime podcast listeners, people who have been listening to podcasts for 10 years, I think that's how they first got started listening to podcasts, was with shows like Stuff You Should Know and How I Built This and other shows like that are just very much like, here is a fact that I am going to present to you that you did not know beforehand, that the medium of podcasting is uniquely suited to teach you. And you fit in really well with that. So that's really, really awesome.
Thank you.
So let's talk about numbers. Rebecca, how important are numbers? Do podcasters need big numbers and a huge social media presence to be represented by an agency or to have commercial success?
It really depends on the creator's goals and how they're thinking about audio as part of their business. For some of the talent that we work with, audio is their focus. And so the numbers do matter in terms of building a sustainable business. For others, audio, as I said earlier, is just an extension of their brand. There's a bigger strategy at play. It's kind of being used as a playground for developing and establishing IP or testing out an idea. And then, of course, it can also be both. It can be a creative space, a creative playground, as well as a place to build business. As agents, our goal, of course, is to make the opportunity strategic and commercial. If a podcaster is looking to build a sustainable business within the podcast ecosystem, then the numbers do matter. That's what draws advertisers towards a podcast. But a social presence, while helpful, isn't necessary. You can still have a successful show without having a massive social media following, and many podcasters do today. In Sharon's case, I think there's a very clear symbiotic relationship between her digital platform, her digital following, and her podcast audience. And she was able to really use her platforms to move audience from social media to her podcast very quickly and very seamlessly. So social media is helpful, to sum it up, but not necessary. And in terms of kind of when we're, assessing if we want to take on a talent, we sometimes will look at their social following, but moreover, it's about the story that they want to tell. Do we believe in the podcast? Do we believe in the idea? And if the answer is yes, again, it's about, can we do the work together? And if the answer is yes, then, we'll move forward.
So Sharon, tell me how you think about your social content, your Instagram content, as it pairs with your podcast. When you put out a new episode, do you follow up on social with check out my latest episode, or do you do more in-depth content on your socials? Because something that I always think about, people always ask, do I need to have social handles for do I need to have an Instagram, a Facebook, a Twitter, a TikTok? Do I need to be on all of that for my podcast? And should I create a separate handle for my podcast? And should it not just be my own handle? And my answer is, you should be where you have bandwidth to be. How do you respond to that?
I totally agree that if you try to do all the things that you don't have bandwidth for, you don't have anybody to help you, you don't understand how any of these things work, then the content is going to be extremely lackluster, and it's not going to be enticing or appealing to other people. And you're going to burn out when you realize that, like, wow, 3 views, come on. That took me hours to do. So you have to be in places that feel energetic for you, that feel like, I like being here, I love the vibe here. And that is going to be something different for different creators. Some people have amazing podcasts and amazing YouTube channels. Some people are in Instagram stories all day like I am. And that is where I love to be, where I feel energized, where my audience knows to find me. And the other sort of channels that I have, like my Twitter and my Facebook and my TikTok, are all just kind of like, meh, meh. You know what I mean? Like, it's not that exciting. And it's always one of those things where it's like, but someday it might be. So it's there in case I need it. Someday it might be. But today's not that day.
Yeah, I always say, reserve the handles on all the social platforms so that nobody else can have them. Experiment every once in a while with those different social platforms. Maybe you learn something new about TikTok and it fits really well with the flow of your latest episode, so you can try that out. But if it doesn't take a step back, think about it. Do you really want to be spending time there? Do you really want to be in the TikTok vortex for 3 hours every day? Probably not. Actually, I encourage not to get sucked into that, because it has ruined my life in a good way and in a bad way.
So much though. I love
Me
it.
too.
But it is really hard to move people off of TikTok and into podcasts.
That was my next question for you.
The linking situation is, unless you're paying for ads, the linking situation on TikTok makes it a very big hurdle. I cannot recall, as an avid TikTok user, so this is not a hate on TikTok scenario, because I love it. I cannot recall a time, even one time, when a creator that I enjoy has enticed me to leave TikTok to listen to a podcast that they're on. Not even one time.
I completely agree with you. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think all creators should be thinking about all of their different, wherever they're posting, they should be thinking about posting for that channel, building up your authority on that channel, specifically on that channel. The content that you post there should stand on its own, so that if somebody only interacts with you on that channel, they respect you as a creator. And eventually, if they want more from you, oh, look, check out the bio. It says they have a podcast. I can do a deeper dive into that person via their podcast. Maybe it takes time. It's probably not a one view of a video and checking out the link, but yeah, it's a really good point. I was going to ask you, do you track on your Instagram stories if people are moving over from your stories to your latest episode?
I can see how many people click on a link, but it doesn't tell you how many people then subscribe, how many people then become regular listeners. But I can tell you that when I heavily promote an episode on my social channels, that episode generally performs better for me. So there is, again, because that's the type of audience relationship I have built up, where I will say, listen, you want to hear this conversation. It's about a topic you care about. And because I am creating episodes with my audience in mind, It's not just about like, well, what do I want to talk about? I'm creating episodes that are useful and educational and entertaining for the people in my community. Then I've built up that level of trust where if I say, listen, I have 2 members of Congress on my show today, and you want to hear this conversation, there is a conversion between like clicking on the link and listening to the episode. Of course, it's not as, the conversions from one platform to another are never as good as we would like them to be. We would like every single person in our audience to click the link and listen. That would be ideal, but that's never going to happen. And so it does become a bit of a strategy of like, how much of my time will I dedicate to trying to convert my audience from one location to another?
That is a big question. And I think maybe this will give you maybe this will comfort you a bit. I think when people are scrolling on social media, and this is a message to everybody, when people are scrolling on social media, they're scrolling on social media. They're not thinking, I really want to scroll on social media so that I can then go and find a podcast to listen to. The behavior at that moment is that they are scrolling on social media. And that is okay, because you are giving them positive associations with your name and your content, so that eventually when they see you on their podcast listening app of choice, they say, Sharon, I want to listen to that podcast because she was just so awesome on Instagram. And I learned so much from her that I want to learn more now.
That's a great point.
So let's shift gears a bit. And I want to come back later to your marketing strategy, Sharon. But Rebecca, I want to know when you first met Sharon, and later once UTA signed Sharon, how did you know that UTA was onto a winner? What were the signs?
Honestly, it was very clear from the outset. And again, I was at ACAST when UTA and Sharon started working together, but it was very clear that Sharon knew her brand, knew her audience, understood how to use her platform to push audience. Because it is challenging to push someone on Instagram over to audio, or someone on YouTube over to audio, but Sharon was really quite successful at doing so. And so she understood how to use her platform to push audience to listen and tune in each week. And it was very clear from the jump that her listeners were engaged. So that's kind of how I knew that we were on to a winner very quickly. The numbers kind of told a very clear story. And the content itself was so good, so thoughtful from day one, that there was really no question in mind that at the time ACAST wanted to do the deal, and that, UTA wanted to represent Sharon. So.
And Sharon, what about for you? When did you know that recording your show was going to be more than just, putting it out into the void and not really hearing anything back? Because I think a lot of podcasters, even podcasters who have spectacular content, are still putting out their show week after week and not really getting back the return that they hope for. So when did you start noticing that you were getting that return?
Well, again, I understand that I have a little bit of a unique situation over many podcasters, and that I did have a large social media following, and my podcast debuted at #1 on Apple in all categories. And so I know that that's unique, and I'm not out here trying to say like everybody has 1 million people that follow them and they can do that too. So I understand that. But one of the things that was interesting was the number of people that then begin to contact me in the sort of agent space, in the network space, as soon as of course, they pay attention to these things. Of course, that's their job to find new talent. So of course, they're looking at like, what's trending, what's happening over here. And so then I really realized that there was going to be an element of commercial success that I had not necessarily planned on when I started receiving all kinds of inquiries from both networks and agents.
Got it. So Sharon, let's go back a bit to your marketing strategy. So you're on social, you post on social, through experimentation and through experience that when you push an episode on social, it tends to do better. What other levers do you pull for marketing? Where else are you marketing?
So one of the 2 things that I have done that I did at the very beginning that I feel like were useful, I would give people a couple tips here. The first one is instead of just dropping one episode at the very beginning, I made sure that I had a trailer and 3 episodes on day 1 of premiere that were out there. And that was designed in some ways, perhaps to game the Apple algorithm, in that it just requires a small amount of listening to multiple episodes, and that is counting as way more engagement with your show than a person listening to 1 episode all the way through. So that is something that I would do again, is recommending putting out a bunch of content all at one time and then moving to being, always on, or whatever format you're going to use. But one of the other strategies that I have used is accessing the existing audience of other people that I know with large followings. And I do that by inviting many of my friends who have large social media followings onto the show. And not because they're necessarily an expert in some history topic, but I invite them there so that I can tell them about the things that I want to share with the audience that day. And so they're listening into a conversation between me and in some of the episodes, they're listening to a conversation between me and a friend, and they're listening to that friend have that kind of like, get out. There were barkless dogs in the 1700s in Puerto Rico.
Basenjis.
Yeah, they're like, they get out. That's just like those kind of moments. It's fun for the audience to listen to somebody else have those moments, but then because they have that existing audience, that they are then promoting their appearance on the show to that existing audience. So the sphere of influence mushroomed quickly using a strategy of accessing other people's existing audiences.
Yeah, I am a big fan at the outset that podcasters should be making lists of shows that they want to collaborate with in some way, whether that's having the hosts of those shows on as guests and then being a guest on their show, guest swaps in that way, promo swaps. Setting up strategic partnerships with other shows is huge, and you've got to do it at scale. And that's why long-term content strategies really make sense for podcast producers. Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing some marketing tips. I have a question for you, Rebecca. Should creators pitch agents, or should they wait to be found? Kind of sounds like waiting around is not the way to go, but I'd love to be proven wrong.
I think it goes both ways, honestly. We receive interest from talent all the time who send us their ideas. They send us concepts they're working on, and we review them carefully. And then, if it makes sense, we'll have a conversation. So it really goes both ways. And then, of course, we're doing tons of outreach and making connections within our networks and scouting, on Apple Podcasts, as Sharon said, and reaching out direct. So it really depends. But I like to be approached. And, we're always looking for interesting people to talk to.
That is great news. And I'm sure many of the people listening will be hitting you up. So, Sharon, what is it that you look for in your representation? How does having an agent benefit you? What can you point to?
I want representation that understands my goals and matches my level of ambition. I actually have spoken to many agents. I took so many meetings. I did not just say like, oh, he seems great, and then just like sign on the dotted line. Guess what? Literally every single person I met with seemed great. There was nobody who was like, what a waste of time. They all seemed great. And it really came down to finding the exact right match for my personality and my level of ambition. And that's going to look different for everybody. So that is one thing, that's how I chose, I took all the meetings. My grandmother always said, don't marry the first boy that comes along. You know what I mean? Like you take your time, find the right one. And so I think that's true of agents as well. Take your time and find the right one, because that is, you're paying them to represent you, and it needs to be the right fit. Then I can also point to one example of, because I had so many networks who were trying to get me to sign with their network when my show was first released. I had this written offer from a network, and I was like, oh, well, that seems great. And then once I didn't take the offer because I knew that I was going to be at some point in the near future signing with an agent. So I said, I'm still working out my representation. I'll let you know when I have, and we can return to this offer. And when I finally signed with UTA, the person that I work with at UTA was like, please rip that up and throw that in the trash because that is garbage. And but to me, it seemed like, oh, okay, well, maybe. It was just like the wealth of knowledge, experience, contacts, understanding what actually is a good offer. Because if you've never done this before, your reaction might be, well, that seems nice.
Right.
You know,
money up front. Awesome.
Yeah, that seems nice.
Yeah.
When in reality, is a terrible deal.
Right. Right. Rebecca, how often do you advise people to quote unquote, rip that up?
I mean, I've never said those exact words. And also I've only been in the business for 3.5 months. So I do want to be honest about how much experience I've had, but sometimes we do see offers that come through the door and they're just not quite right or up to our standards. And we will tell a talent to, look elsewhere, or we'll negotiate and make it better.
Rebecca's much more diplomatic than I am. Rebecca's like,
I know she's very measured. I'm very impressed.
It's not quite right. And I'm like, throw it in the garbage where it belongs.
And I'm like kind of in the middle of that.
Give me a year and I'll get there.
Rebecca will be throwing things in the trash in no time.
So Sharon, where would you be at this point in your podcast career without representation, without UTA?
I probably would have just taken a deal that I was like, oh, that seems nice. And had absolutely no idea of what kind of terms I was looking for because I was so new to the podcast space. Would have had no idea what kind of things are important to include and exclude in a contract. I probably would have just gotten my regular lawyer to look over an agreement. And that regular lawyer probably would not have had anywhere near the level of experience to know what makes a good audio deal and what doesn't. So that in and of itself, just getting me in front of the right buyers, knowing who might make a good partner for a show like mine. So my agent at UTA, as Rebecca mentioned, pitched my show to ACAST, where Rebecca came from. And so knowing like ACAST might actually make a great partner for your show. But this other network that does just like Bravo celebrities, that is a totally different kettle of fish. Like they're great at doing that thing, but they might not be great at doing this thing because that's not their specialty. So knowing who the good partners are and what kind of terms to protect your business interests. And then also just being the person who does all of the negotiating so you don't have to have those weird, uncomfortable conversations. And they know where to push. They know how much money networks actually have or can get for you. There's just all of those little nuanced things that if you don't have all kinds of experience in podcasting, which frankly new people, most of them don't, you might be leaving opportunities or money or sanity on the table. And it absolutely pays to have to rely on the expertise of somebody that you trust.
So sadly, we have to begin wrapping up, but I really want to ask this question because I want to make sure we are giving helpful takeaways to the folks who are listening into our conversation. Rebecca, what does UTA look for in future audio talent, and how can podcasters make themselves attractive to agents?
So I'm, only speaking on behalf of UTA, but broadly, we are looking for talent who have true perspective, which I said earlier, story to tell, someone with a unique point of view, and someone who's really ambitious about the audio space and really believes in the power of audio. But, more importantly, we're looking for clients who are collaborative, who are invested in doing the work, because, building a singular podcast or a brand in the audio space is hard work. It takes time, it takes effort. You have to be incredibly considered in your approach to the medium. And then also when considering clients, we're always thinking about the 360 approach. So how can we tap into other departments at UTA? When we're looking at talent, we're thinking about their business as a whole and their presence in other verticals. So, I'd say have interests in audio and outside of audio, really be bullish about how you're building a brand, and also know your voice and know what you're willing to do, what you're willing to say, and what you're not willing to say and do. And if you have that strong perspective, then, we'll be excited to work together.
Thank you to Sharon McMahon and Rebecca Steinberg for joining me for this session on how to build a commercially successful podcast at the International Women's Podcast Festival in partnership with Pinterest. Listeners, viewers, I hope you gained a lot from this conversation, and thank you for your time.